I've been covering Grooveboxes here on YouTube for quite a while now. So if you're new to the space and want to get into it, but find the amount of options overwhelming or the terminology intimidating, you've come to the right place. I want to try to demystify some of this stuff, starting with defining what a Groovebox even is. The key features of a Groovebox are that it is self-contained, meaning that it can work by itself without needing to be plugged into a computer or anything else, just a pair of speakers or headphones, and some of them even have built-in speakers. That's the big thing, is that it's self-contained, and allows you to record and program musical parts, usually looping in nature, and that it allows for some degree of live performance and improvisation. Different people will be more or less strict about the application of the word Groovebox. Some people just use it as like a catch-all term for self-contained music production devices, while others use it to specifically mean a self-contained device that brings together elements of synths and drum machines and puts them together into an interface that allows for live performance and very flexible music production. For example, one very common entry point into the Groovebox world with something that's budget and beginner friendly is the Novation Circuit. This right here is the Novation Circuit Tracks, and it is very portable, battery powered in this case, although not all Grooveboxes are, and it has 2 built-in synth tracks and 4 built-in drum tracks. So you could make a full sounding piece of music just on this thing by itself without a computer. And it has multiple different patterns, which are basically holding tanks for notes. Think of it like MIDI clips in your DAW. You can have a bunch of these and you can launch them, basically creating live performance in the way that someone like deadmau5 or Skrillex would do. Various Grooveboxes will sit in kind of various places on the spectrum between workstation, synthesizer, and drum machine, and the lines between those can get a bit blurry. But the way to think of it is that it's basically a potluck of those things brought together into kind of an all-in-one music gadget, geared more towards live performance and very flexible, kind of on-the-fly working. I mentioned that Grooveboxes allow you to either record or program in notes, and that's not nearly as intimidating as I'm making it sound. In order to program notes, either drum or like melodic notes in, you're going to do that into the Grooveboxes sequencer. Specifically, most Grooveboxes use step sequencers, which even if you're not familiar with the term, you might be familiar with what one looks like. This is a step sequencer in FL Studio, and I am presupposing a bit of music production background here. You've probably at least seen this around. You can click in notes into the individual little rectangles, and when you hit play, FL scrolls through them, and when there's a lit up box, it plays that note. Hopefully fairly straightforward so far. Now, imagine that you could change more than one thing about each of those individual steps. Maybe change which note each thing is playing, or change what sound is on each of those steps. And now, instead of clicking those in with a mouse, imagine that you're pushing physical buttons, and you've arrived at a physical hardware sequencer, which is what FL Studio's interface for that kind of thing takes its inspiration from. Here's a quick example of what that actually looks like, once again using the Novation Circuit Tracks as an example. Most Grooveboxes allow you to click in notes manually or just live record into the sequencers. And you can have a little loop that you've sequenced in or recorded in contained within a pattern. And a pattern is basically a single passage of music. It might be 1 bar long, it might be 4 to 8 bars long. It depends on the Groovebox. Some of them have shorter patterns that can be chained together, so they all just play one after another. And some of them can just have longer patterns as a default. Different Grooveboxes work differently, but a pattern is what's going to contain like your song ideas, essentially. And then you'll string together multiple patterns to create a full song, either by switching between them live on the fly, once again, much like a kind of traditional music producer slash DJ would do in a live set using Ableton, or you can string them together in a song mode, which some Grooveboxes will have. Or, if you're me, you might record a bunch of separate patterns and then either export or record those individual tracks into your DAW and then build out a full arrangement that way. Different Grooveboxes have different export capabilities. Some of them can record multi-track over USB, so like you'll have each isolated track recording into your DAW all at once. Some of them can just directly export stuff as sound files, and then some of them just can only be recorded by, say, your audio interface or computer or something like that. So those are the very basics of how a Groovebox handles musical ideas and how you would use them to build up those musical ideas, potentially into either a live performance or a full song. Now let's get into some more specific terminology that often can get a bit muddy because, well, there's some terms that can mean more than one thing. So if someone refers to a Groovebox as being mono or mono and monophonic, here's what they mean. Monophonic means that something can only play one sound at a time. And unfortunately, in the world of hardware, that is a limitation that a lot of people do deem acceptable, including myself. I've had quite a few devices that I've used that each track can only play one sound at a time, but you can usually switch between multiple sounds on those tracks. It's a bit of a weird way to work. It takes some getting used to, and not everyone's going to be willing to put up with that. But that's what monophonic means. Versus polyphonic, poly like many, means that you can play multiple notes at the same time. This is terminology that you're also just going to see in the general synthscape as well, because there are some synths that can only play one note at a time, and others that can play multiple notes. And so if something has, say, 6 voice polyphony, that means it can play up to 6 notes at the same time. Some Grooveboxes will only be able to play samples monophonically, meaning that each track can only play audio files and only one audio file at a time per track. So say an 8-track monophonic device, you could hear up to 8 sounds layered on top of each other at a time, and if you're switching between multiple different sounds on each track, it can build up a pretty dense arrangement pretty quickly. A lot of Grooveboxes do have polyphonic synth engines though, which is something that you probably want to know going in depending on what your goals are. For instance, if you're trying to do stuff that's very sample chop based, you might actually be okay with monophonic stuff, whether you're making old school hip hop or IDM. On the other hand, you might want to make big chord stacks and have all of these like notes stacked on top of each other, and maybe you want to have them like evolve a bunch over time. Well, in that case, you're probably better served getting something with polyphonic synth engines. And there's the in-between of polyphonic sampling engines, and that's not the only way that the word mono is used, because it can also mean in terms of the stereo spectrum. So if you are hearing something on a pair of headphones, for instance, you're hearing in stereo. There's the 2 signals that are coming at your ears. But if a sound only comes out of the center and like isn't panned at all, that's a mono sound. So like old school records are in mono, and some Grooveboxes will take a stereo sound and collapse it down to mono, so it's only coming up the center. That is an unfortunate limitation of some devices. Sometimes devices will even do a hybrid where they'll have stereo synthesis and mono sampling in terms of the stereo spectrum, and that's how you get a mono in terms of the stereo spectrum. Monophonic can only play one sound at a time, Groovebox like the Digitakt, Polyon Tracker, or Novation Circuit Rhythm. So when you hear a gadget reviewer talk about a monophonic sampler, for instance, or a synth engine with 6 voices of polyphony, hopefully now you can have a decent idea of what that means and whether that will fit what you're after in a device. Another term that you'll hear gadget reviewers use is knob per function. This just means that each individual control on the actual physical device corresponds to 1 or 2 functions that it is capable of performing and not much more. A lot of Grooveboxes don't have that, however. A lot of them have buttons that do many different things, or maybe pads that change color depending on what mode you're in. Or you might even have a screen and the function that the knobs and buttons are performing changes depending on what's on screen. If something really feels like a computer to use, you might see someone refer to a device as a DAW in a box. Now, There is some debate about whether or not something that one would call a DAW in a box would qualify as a Groovebox, or whether we should call it a workstation. But once again, you're going to hear stuff like that all kind of just grouped under the easy catch-all term. And so that's something that you're unfortunately just going to have to get used to. So something like the MPC-1 would be considered a DAW in a box. It has a lot of the hallmarks of a Groovebox, but it's basically a computer with a touchscreen and a bunch of extra buttons and like audio and MIDI inputs. Different people want different experiences out of Grooveboxes. A lot of people want them to get away from the feeling of using a computer, because if you're like me, I work a day job in engineering. I don't want to stare much more at a computer screen than I do when either working or gaming, and so I want something that's got like a lot of buttons and pretty lights and something that doesn't feel much like using a computer. But on the other hand, the more something feels like using a computer, probably the more power it gives you and the more control it gives you over your sound. So that's a bit of a trade-off. The less computer-like something is, the more tactile and hands-on it feels, but also it might require more like button press and shortcut combinations that you need to keep in mind and remember, and it might restrict how much control you have over your sound, versus something with like a proper computer screen and basically a computer brain inside of it might give you a lot more control, but might feel less hands-on to use. And different people have different tolerances for that. Personally, I'm actually completely fine with both. It just depends on what I feel like working on. I alluded to samples and patches a bit earlier. I do want to make sure I make that really clear, because I've seen this cause confusion before. A sample is an audio file. So a wave, an MP3, something like that. Just a pure audio file that you feed into a device and then play back on a drum machine or a keyboard. And some devices will have a separation between samples and synth patches, which I'll get to in a second. Others will just let you load a sample into like a drum machine configuration or map it to a keyboard and play it like an instrument. It depends on the device, like how much it restricts what you're allowed to do with samples. And of course, there's the rare Groovebox like the Model Cycles that doesn't accept samples at all and only has synth engines that run synth patches. And a synth patch is basically a preset for that synth that controls how it sounds. So hopefully you're at least somewhat familiar with a music production environment and know what a preset is. You can't necessarily load a sample into a synth engine and have it work like a preset, and vice versa. And finally, let's talk a bit about MIDI. If you are just like a fairly new music producer, you're probably only familiar with MIDI as the keyboard that you plug into your computer to control your virtual instruments, which is a form of MIDI. That's probably MIDI over USB, and that's how your hardware device and computer talk to each other. Before that existed just MIDI with no USB, which is how physical hardware instruments talked to each other before computers ever entered the picture. And that kind of setup is still alive and well today. So someone might start with just a completely self-contained Groovebox, but then they'll use MIDI to control a hardware synth, sometimes even multiple. People can build some pretty crazy setups all without a computer that run with the Groovebox being the central brain controlling everything around it. That can get very expensive, I will warn you right now, and some people get kind of cranky about either trying too hard to go with what's called a DAW-less setup or arguing over what a DAW-less setup even means. I just want to let you know that that's like an option available to you, and some Grooveboxes can start self-contained and then you can expand them further from there. There's 5-pin MIDI, which is the full-sized MIDI cable with this configuration, and there's TRS, which basically looks like the audio jack that you used to have in your car before Apple removed the headphone jack. And you can convert between those two formats. Different synths and different Grooveboxes will either send or receive different size MIDI inputs, but if you have the right converters, they can all talk to each other. And you can even convert between MIDI and USB with certain converter cables as well. And in addition to that, as a connection, some Grooveboxes can also accept audio in, either in the form of a headphone jack sized input or in the form of a 1/4 inch sized input. And this is basically a guitar cable, just a bog standard basic guitar cable. What these inputs do will depend on the Groovebox. Some Grooveboxes can actually record with those audio inputs, so you could say plug a synth into your Groovebox, play a little passage or a single note, and you can sample it, and then you can like use that in your productions. However, some Grooveboxes can only pass audio through them and not record, which is what you would do if you wanted to use your Groovebox as, like I've mentioned, the brain of a setup. And so you might have a bunch of synths and then pass that audio through your Groovebox, and so then it starts to work as a mixer as well as a drum machine, a synth, and a sequencer. Like I mentioned, these can get pretty all-in-one. Hopefully by now you've been introduced to a lot of the terminology and concepts swirling around in the Groovebox space. If you'd like to learn about some of my favorites, you can click or tap up over here, and if you'd like to see some more Groovebox stuff, you can click or tap up over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.